the Sega Game Gear. For many of us, this console holds many precious childhood memories. But sadly, there was a huge batch of bad capacitors sold to Sega during the manufacturing of this wonderful handheld console. Because of this, a lot of them have died over the years, and it's very hard to find a working one anymore. Do you still have your old Sega Game Gear? Does it not work right? Is it on the fritz? Is it possible that it is nearing the end of its life? Fear not. Drumblanket is here to help you in this do-it-yourself tutorial where I teach you how to fix these capacitors and get your Sega Game Gear running like the day you pulled it out of the box. Welcome to the tutorial, everybody. This is a quick, comprehensive tutorial. I'm doing everything I can to show you exactly what you need to do and what you need to know, what you need to have in order to fix your Game Gear console. Or hey, let's say you find one on eBay. You don't have to worry about buying one that works. You can buy one and then buy the replacement capacitor kit for it, and I'll teach you how to fix it, and you get it running just like brand new. I wouldn't lie to you. You come here because you want to be able to trust the person who's telling you how to fix things. I'm your guy. Thank you so much for watching the tutorial, guys. Let's get started. So the first things that we're going to need to get are the capacitor replacement kits. There are several available, and depending on which console you actually have, there are 3 different variations. You're going to need a different capacitor kit for each one. I'll show you how to identify that in this tutorial. You're also going to need some solder and a soldering iron and a pair of needle nose pliers. If you have a soldering braid, that's also very helpful. Not necessary, but it does make the job a little bit easier. So the first thing that I'm going to share with you guys is this guide that comes from NintendoRepairHut.com. You can find a link to it in the description below. This is a totally comprehensive guide that you can use, and I am also going to be using pictures from this guide during this video to kind of help point out some things. Now, when you get your capacitor replacement kit, I want you to be able to identify which side is the negative and which side is the positive. When it comes to LEDs, it's strictly based on the length of their legs. And a lot of capacitors also include that, the longer leg being the positive and the shorter side being the negative, but not all capacitors actually use this method. So sometimes you'll get capacitors that are identical in length with their legs. How do you tell which side is the negative? The negative side is identified by this strip on the side. There's always a strip indicating which is the negative side. Now, it might be a different color. It could be black, it could be white, it could be gold. It doesn't matter. As long as that strip is on that side, that is your negative side. There are 3 versions of the Game Gear console in regards to the capacitor layout. And to identify what version you have, you're going to open up your console. And as you notice in the picture, this one only has 1 ASIC chip. However, some consoles actually have 2 ASIC chips. If your console has 2 ASIC chips, then there is only 1 layout of the capacitors for this version. If your system has only 1 ASIC chip, there are 2 layouts of the capacitors. And in order to find out what layout you have, you're going to need to look at the left side of the motherboard, as seen in this picture here. And you can see it says VA1. Now, my personal Game Gear says VA4, and it actually only has 1 ASIC chip on it. In order to open up your Game Gear console, you're going to have to flip it over to the back side, and you're going to need to remove the battery flaps that basically keep the batteries in place. And you'll notice there are 6 holes along the bottom here. These are for Phillips head screwdrivers. You'll also need a 4.5mm nut setter screw to remove this screw up here underneath of where the game actually inserts. There are 2 cables that are connecting the motherboard, one to the power card and one to the sound card. You'll need to disconnect those from the green side of the plug. There's a blue side and there's a green side. You'll pull the green plug out. And then there is also a small cable here that connects from the sound card to the speaker. You'll need to disconnect that as well. Now, there's an RF shield on this, and I ended up removing mine eventually, but you do not need to remove that just to do this repair. It's not necessary. Now, there are also 8 Phillips head screws that are holding down the motherboard. You'll need to remove those. And once those have been removed, you can then lift the motherboard up out of this casing. In this picture, I'm showing you what a capacitor looks like that you're going to need to replace. that are inside. Some of them look like this one, and some of them are kind of black and boxy looking, which you'll see me remove one of those later on in this video as well. Those are surface mounts, and there are also radial mounts. Radial mounts basically stick all the way through into the motherboard with little holes that are set there for them. There aren't a whole lot of those, but just be aware that you'll have surface mount and radial mount capacitors that you're dealing with during this whole repair. So in this picture, I'm showing you a piece of the motherboard that has had the surface mount capacitors removed. And it's very important that when you're removing these that you don't force it off. What you're going to want to do is you're going to need to solder up your soldering tip, and make sure that you have a fine soldering tip. That will help you as well. Make sure that it's a nice fine tip and nothing too fat. You don't want to force off these capacitors. You want to take your time with it. Now you can see here in the bottom it says place tip of soldering iron here. So there is basically a location on all of these, every single capacitor that you're going to be removing. There is a small exposed area of solder. It helps to dress your soldering tip with a little bit of solder, and then place that on that little area that it's telling you that it's pointing out there. And then you can slowly wiggle the capacitor back and forth. You'll do it on both sides. There's a negative side and there's a positive side. Once you have done that, the capacitor will release quite easily. Be careful not to force it. As you can see, there is a contact destroyed because the person didn't take the capacitor off correctly. So you don't want to do that. If you remove any contacts, especially on the positive side, you're pretty much screwed. So be very delicate, be very careful, be very patient. Now, when it comes to actually replacing specific capacitors, you're going, well, how do I know which ones do I need to remove? In this comprehensive guide that I've given you, you'll scroll down to the part listing, and it even says 1 ASIC VA1 capacitor index, or 1 ASIC VA4 capacitor index, and then 2 ASIC capacitor index. The way this works is each capacitor is labeled on the motherboard. If you look at the motherboard, you will see things like R33 or C25 or B36 and stuff like that. Those are identification marks. Every single capacitor that you're going to be replacing starts with the letter C. So there's C1, C31, C33, C36, so things like that. Again, it all depends on the layout of yours, depending on which VA you have, if it's VA1 or VA4. You're going to have to identify that using this guide, and the guide is very, very good about keeping it straightforward and to where you're not confused about it. All positive terminals are marked with a little plus sign, so it's very easy to find which side is the positive. Again, as long as you keep in mind that the negative side is indicated with a strip and you aren't putting that strip on the positive side, you're going to be putting them into place correctly. Each capacitor has its own value. Some of them are 6.3 volts, some of them are 6 volts, some of them are 50 volts. There's also a UF range, which I'm not sure what UF stands for, but sometimes it's 22, sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 40 or 47. It's important that whenever you have your capacitor kit, if they haven't given you identical capacitors that you're going to need to replace, if let's say it's 6.3 volts and you don't have 6.3 volts but you have 10 volts and the UF value is the same, say it's 22 UF and 10 volts, that will work on 22 UF 6.3 volts. As long as it's the next number higher, you're going to be okay. The UF value is extremely important though, so be sure that you're paying attention to that. A lot of these capacitors, sometimes there are certain things that are hard to find, like 6.3 volts or whatever. So they'll give you the next step up, but they're always making sure that that UF value is identical to the UF value of the original capacitor. Now the first thing I'm going to do is work on the power card, and the power card has mostly radial mount capacitors. To remove these, what I do is I locate where the capacitor is, and then I flip the card over and look at the back and locate where the positive and negative posts are sticking through. And to remove it, I simply grab a hold of the capacitor with my fingers, and on the opposite side, touch it with some solder and pull it straight out of the board. and then I replace it with a brand new one, sticking it all the way through and attaching it on the backside with the solder and then clipping off those posts. Now, another thing that I did with this power card that I did not end up showing is on the back side of this, right where the power port is, there was a cold soldering point, which means the solder had cracked over time, and when I would plug this in, the power would flash, so it would lose connection to power, and we don't want that. So in order to fix that, I just dressed it with some new solder. I didn't even take the old solder off. I just put a little new solder on there. It took care of the cold soldering point. There's no longer a crack there. It's like brand new. Next, we're going to move over to the sound card. And you can see here that this is all straight up surface mount capacitors. I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I showed you before. Just placing my tip on the area where there is a little solder showing and slowly working it back and forth on both sides until I get it to come free. Once I get it to come free, I will replace that capacitor with a new capacitor of the same value. Moving on to the motherboard, exactly the same thing. Now you'll notice that these capacitors are the small black box capacitors that I was talking about. This actually has a range of different kinds of capacitors. It has the black box capacitors, it also has the radial mount capacitors, and it also has the other capacitors that we saw on the sound card. They're all very easy to see. There are a few other things that look like capacitors on the motherboard, but if you're using the list that I just showed you in that guide, you're not going to accidentally remove something that didn't need to be removed. Identify each of these with the number and the value of the capacitor. If you can do that, which is very easy to do, it's a very easy concept. Okay, this says C3. I need to find C3 on the motherboard. The hardest part is locating where C3 is, or C4, or whatever it is you're looking for, because the numbers are kind of small. A magnifying glass might help you, but your search is going to be the hardest thing to do. Everything else is cake. Now, this is what my motherboard ended up looking like after I had replaced all of the capacitors. So now that we have all of the capacitors replaced, we can then go ahead and reassemble our Game Gear back together, doing everything exactly opposite as when we took it apart. 8 screws back into the motherboard, 2 screws in the sound card, 2 screws in the power card. Make sure to reconnect those cables going from the motherboard and the speaker cable as well back to the sound card. And screw it back together, and guys, there it is. Working flawlessly, just like we opened it up on day one. Now I'm going to share a little something else with you guys. I'm actually not finished with this Game Gear. I have to take it back apart again because I'm turning it into a home console system that you can play on your television. Yeah, in 1080p, that's the goal. Hopefully I can make that work. I know I can at least get it to where you can play it on the TV. I ended up buying a special mod chip for that, and the next video will be showing you where to buy that chip, how to install the chip, and everything else, I mean, until I get it to where it's a fully working console. It's going to take me a bit, but it's going to be worth it. I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to bring these do-it-yourself tutorials to you guys. If I was able to help you make the repair successfully, if you enjoyed the video, if I showed you something you didn't know, go ahead and give me a like and let me know by leaving me a comment down below. I love talking to you. I love hearing from you. Feel free to share the video, and if you haven't yet, click subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell so you'll know whenever I put out a new video. I've got all kinds of different content on my channel. I've got old retro game playthroughs, I've got new game playthroughs, I've got do-it-yourself cosmetic case mods for like Xbox One, PlayStation 4, showing you how to take your console and turning it into something beautiful with LED lights and case cutting and plexiglass. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I like to do. And if you like that kind of thing, you came to the right place. Thanks again so much for watching, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.